Ethical Perspectives on the News is produced by the Interreligious Council of Linn County, which is solely responsible for its content. The views and opinions expressed on this program do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of KCRG TV9.
Good morning. Welcome to this week's edition of Ethical Perspectives on the News. My name is Craig Vansandt. I teach at the University of Northern Iowa and hold the David W. Wilson Chair in Business Ethics there. A few weeks ago, we addressed the topic of the common good versus self-advancement. After the show, some of the panelists continued the conversation, and as a result, we decided to explore the topic of intergenerational poverty, which we will discuss on this morning's episode. Our first panelist today is Stacey Walker, a Linn County Supervisor from District 1. Stacey, thank you for being back on the show with us.
Thank you for having me.
Our second panelist is Karla Twedt-Ball, and this is a mouthful, so I'll get this straight. She is the Senior Vice President, Programs and Community Investment for the Greater Cedar Rapids Community Foundation. Karla, thank you for appearing on the show with us.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We're glad to have you. And finally, Chris Peters has agreed to provide his views for our discussion today. Chris is a physician and has run for the United States House of Representatives in Iowa's 2nd District. Chris, we really appreciate you being here as well.
It's good to be back.
Good. As I mentioned, I teach at the University of Northern Iowa. The primary focus of my teaching is on business ethics. And during that class, the students and I invariably come to the issue of fairness. This concept is fundamental to the idea of ethical behavior, and in trying to determine what fairness is and how best to express it in business and society, we almost always encounter the concept of equality, which leads to the question of equality of what? Should we be looking at the equality of opportunity or the equality of outcomes? In other words, should we all begin the race from one starting line, or should some people be given head starts or handicaps? And what about at the end of the race? Should we all tie, or should there be winners and losers? To address some of these questions, I'm going to rely on our panelists. Stacey, I want to start the conversation with you. You were the one who mentioned intergenerational poverty on our previous show. I'd like you to try and set the stage for us by defining what that is and why it's so important.
Well, I'll give my best shot at a definition here, and surely there are many different definitions of poverty and intergenerational poverty. But in a nutshell, I think what many academics have tried to do is define poverty as an economic measure of how people are doing. And right now the federal government looks at poverty based on someone's income. How much money do you make, and how does your income relate to how other people in your immediate surroundings are doing? And they've established a baseline. And if you fall under a certain level, you are considered in poverty. But I think a lot of recent research, and I'm sure we'll get into it and unpack it today, challenges policymakers and thought leaders to think about poverty from different perspectives. So we need to think about overall, how is a person doing? And think about people who are living in poverty or who are just above the poverty line, or maybe earning above the poverty line but still are struggling to make ends meet. I think that is a new challenge for policymakers and thought leaders.
And talk a little bit about the intergenerational aspect of this. What do we mean by that?
Well, so, what is promising is that a lot of thinkers now are starting to understand poverty almost as a disease, if you will, to use that metaphor, insofar as it can be passed down almost in a hereditary sense, right? So we are seeing families and households that are being afflicted with poverty, and we are also seeing that their offspring and further generations are also finding it problematic to escape the throes of poverty. So we use the term intergenerational poverty or cyclical or generational poverty to denote financial hardship that is passed down from one generation and makes it hard for folks in one particular family, one particular race or demographic group to be able to break the confines of poverty.
A very complex problem, it sounds like. Chris, let me turn to you. You're the person who I think actually suggested that we do this show on this topic. I know you think a lot about how society is structured and the impacts those structures have on individuals in that society. What are some of the structural elements you see that lead to intergenerational poverty?
Sure. Well, I think there's several. I focused on a couple, which I'll bring up, and I'm sure Karla and Stacey probably have some others that they looked at. But kind of as a general theme of mine and how I approach these issues, I always want to kind of see what existing policy has led to, maybe possibly has led to outcomes that we think aren't fair. For example, as opposed to saying what kind of new policies can we put in to fix a problem, what are some policies that might need to be undone to address the problem first, for example. And so looking at intergenerational poverty, I'm going to preface this by saying I think this is an issue that conservatives really should be taking a look at, not just income inequality, but wealth inequality, and particularly savings for retirement inequality. It's something that we really should be looking at. Two of the biggest things for wealth inequality, the biggest ways that people accumulate wealth that they can potentially pass down to future generations, are things like retirement savings and housing. Those are kind of the two biggest things that Americans that are a little bit better off can put money aside that they can be passed along to their children and grandchildren, et cetera. And we have some structures that exist that actually make it less likely that people at lower income rungs can accumulate that wealth in either form of retirement savings or household equity and pass that along to future generations. So those are kind of two of the issues that I looked at. I know I shared that online or via email beforehand, and we can go into more detail later, but one on the housing side I'd point out is the mortgage interest deduction, our ability, if you own a home, being able to write some of that interest off on your taxes. That, of course, if you don't own a home, you don't get that benefit, so the very nature of that tax break tends to be a regressive one, so renters, for example, don't get it. And it also actually paradoxically increases the prices of homes by about 5% is what some estimates have said, which reduces the availability of home ownership to people at lower income levels. So it's actually, and it has not improved home ownership rates, it's actually decreased them by 4 to 5% as well. So it hasn't lived up to what it was intended to do. Another one has to do again with just retirement, partly Social Security itself tends to be regressive in practice. And secondly, people at lower income tend not to have access to 401ks or defined benefit pension programs or even IRAs, and so they rely entirely on Social Security. But that again is something that isn't something, a savings that you cannot pass down to later generations. So it stacks the deck against people at lower income levels.
Well, and I think it's important to point out that you are talking about more than just people in the lower income brackets don't have income to save for those things. There are tax and other legal structures that even if they could put some aside, make it even more difficult for them to do that.
Correct.
I'd like to spend a little more time talking about some of these structural elements. And to introduce that, I want to read a quick quote from a gentleman named Alfie Kohn, who is an educator and writer. And talking in a book that he had, No Contest, The Case Against Competition, he says, we prefer to hold individuals responsible for whatever happens, or at the most, to find a convenient proximate cause. Rarely are events understood in their historical or economic or social context. What we're talking about here with structural elements are those historical, economic, and social contexts. So, Karla, Stacey, let me ask you, what are some other elements that work against getting out of poverty?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you set the stage for the conversation today, one of the things you talked about was, what do we mean by equality? And I mean, I think one important thing to bring up is that we don't all start at the same starting line. So things like Social Security, things like housing, we find differential impacts or differential experiences right now based on race. And a lot of that comes back to historic practices. So part of the reason people have different places in their lives right now, when we look at, you know, what happened with housing discrimination and redlining, and, you know, researchers find that we still have those discriminatory practices in place. We have some really great legislation. There doesn't necessarily need to be a policy fix on that, but there does need to be an implementation on the sort of monitoring that's allowed in that place. So, I mean, I think that's one of the elements that leads into the housing, and Social Security was only made available to certain Americans at the time. So I also think about things like education. So partly because of redlining, partly because of how we build housing complex, we have concentrated poverty in certain areas, and so then that leads to areas with schools that have children of high poverty concentrations, and we have a property tax formula in part about how we fund public education. So, you know, we try to equalize that with Title I funding, but we still find that the resources available for low-income students aren't the same. And we know that from our experiences that we see. You know, we have schools that have lots of resources and access to, you know, parent volunteers and the teachers that want to maybe gravitate toward the higher income schools. So, you know, we see that in our educational settings too.
Stacey, did you want to jump in there?
No, I would echo all of what Karla pointed out, and I appreciate we also acknowledging the fact that these impacts are not only affecting individuals on the lower economic side of the spectrum, but also individuals of color in this community. And around the country tend to have disproportionate impacts on issues relating to poverty. And so I'll give you a brief example. I tried to pull the latest numbers. Iowa is experiencing a poverty rate between 10 and 12%. And that seems relatively low, but we're still talking about 300,000 Iowans that are living below the federally defined poverty line. Now, if you break that data out even more, we find that Iowa has about 12% of children living in poverty. We have 18% of Latinos living in poverty, 25% of Native Americans, and 32.3% of African Americans are living in poverty. Those numbers alone are alarming, and I think call policymakers and thought leaders to task to address that. And then I want to also point out one other group of people that don't receive a lot of attention. And the United Way of East Central Iowa and other United Ways across the country have done a lot of work on this. And they've identified a group of people who are asset limited, income constrained, but also employed. And so what that means is that these are individuals who are living at or just above the federally defined poverty line. They have jobs, they're earning an income, but they are not earning enough to cover their expenses. And these are folks like you know, a good percentage of Americans, I think it's somewhere of 40% of Americans cannot withstand a $400 emergency expense, right? These are those individuals, and we need to start thinking about, again, as I said in my opening remarks, how we can address not only people who are living below that number, that federally defined poverty line, but individuals who are doing the right thing, working full-time, sometimes 1, 2, 3 jobs, and still aren't able to get by. That is a pressing issue for the most prosperous country in the world.
I'm glad you mentioned the most prosperous country in the world. That makes all of what we're talking about even more concerning. I did want to follow up on one thing you said. You mentioned poverty rates for several different races and ethnic groups in the state of Iowa. I'm imagining that some of our viewers may also want to know a comparable rate for Caucasians. Do you know that number?
I do. I have the data for this area, but according to the American Community Survey, it's 6% for Caucasians in this area. I think the years I was looking at, it was 32% for African Americans.
A significant difference.
I'd also point out that that same survey shows that the labor force participation rates are the same. The poverty rate is much different. So it's not, and the employment rates, the unemployment rate is double for African Americans as for whites in this area for that time period that I was looking at. So the labor force participation rate then would suggest, I mean, they're trying to work, they're actively searching for jobs, they're not as likely to get jobs, and when they do, they're at much lower income levels.
Which in our previous conversations, we talked about institutional harm that's being done to people. The private sector is an institution, and the government, the public sector, is an institution. And if African Americans, to continue on this line of thought, are accessing jobs at the same rate, or securing jobs, or participating in the labor market, but yet aren't earning as much as their white peers in the labor market, we've got some serious questions that need to be asked and answered as to why that is. And these are some of the reasons why poverty persists for certain demographics. And we have to be willing to have the conversation about why and figure out if there are government solutions to asking the hard questions of corporate America as to why you can employ 2 people doing the same job who are equally qualified but pay one person a different wage and get away with that. I know we have laws in place to prevent that, but as the data would suggest is we have things like that happening. Why are certain groups of people locked out of the economy? Why are we creating another underclass of people, and how are we going to prevent it?
Well, you brought up business being a private institution. I teach business, so I'm particularly interested in that. Do we have any faith that if we put the problem to business and ask them to solve it, business would respond?
Well, I don't know if I can answer that specifically, but I guess I'm just going to, my bias is fundamentally a little bit different here than Stacey's is perhaps. I always start with what has government done that is making the situation more unfair, and I've already kind of talked about that, and to bounce off your quote, I'm going to use Milton Friedman, who we brought up I think last time we were together, who says it's a great mistake to judge policies and programs based upon their intention rather than their results. And so again, things like the mortgage interest deduction and Social Security, how it is in practice, we should be judging them on their actual effects. And I think in this case we could point to both of those programs and say they're actually harming the people we're actually here to discuss to a large degree. People are at the lower income levels, and particularly people of color. For Social Security itself, if you're just looking at people receiving Social Security benefits, it tends to benefit whites more so than it does Hispanics, because Hispanics have larger family sizes as a rule, and it benefits whites at the expense of African Americans because they tend to have a lower life expectancy at birth. Now, interestingly, if Stacey and I both reach 65, our life expectancies from that point aren't much different, but the chance for an African American, especially male, to make it to 65 is substantially less. So they may put into Social Security for a long period of their working lives, and then that money is basically lost to the system. So again, my bias is always kind of to first start looking at where has government failed, and then secondarily, markets do what markets are going to do. They respond to the incentives of markets, and they respond to what government puts out there, that, the regulations that exist. I think you talked about beforehand the donut hole where people fall. If their income rises above a certain level, they have no longer access to some poverty relief programs like TANF and SNAP and things like that. So they actually have an incentive to not earn as much, or they could have the incentive. So again, my bias is always looking at where is government maybe done the wrong thing, falling in line with Milton Friedman's quote, and then secondarily look at things that we could do better in the private sector.
Okay. We're already running short on time. Karla, let me specifically ask you about this. My understanding of what you do for gainful employment is on the solutions side. Mm-hmm. What kinds of things do you see that would benefit the problem that we're addressing?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's a really big question. So,
Sure.
I look to multiple levels. And I think there are some federal policy solutions on that, but focusing on the sort of community side of things, I work with nonprofits, so I'm going to think more about sort of what sort of nonprofit programs are existing. Sure. Back to this concept of intergenerational poverty, I think there are a number of solutions that are good. They're research-based, and we're able to implement maybe at scale or at least partially within our local region. And I think when you're talking about intergenerational poverty, solutions that are working with two generations, so addressing both the needs of the parents and also the needs of the children simultaneously, because doing either one of those in isolation isn't a full answer. So one of the things that's happening locally is the Opportunity Center. So that's a collaboration among Kirkwood and the Cedar Rapids Public Library and United Way and a number of other partners to help work people into better economic situations. So helping them figure out what the next step might be for education, providing the different needs they have. So I think at some point they're looking at ESL classes, job training and placement, transportation assistance, financial literacy programs, helping with housing if they need to. So it's really sort of multifaceted. Also addressing some of the needs of young adult and adult learners are programs that are happening at Kirkwood. The K-PACE program really meets people where they're at and helps them find the best path forward for them, whether it's a certificate program and so forth. And there are a number of other organizations that are working in that area. There's a number of efforts locally that are thinking about education, because we know the research shows that kids who are successful in their educational track obviously have much better outcomes. And so there's some great early childhood programs from the Read Ahead program. The Cedar Rapids Public Library has started the Dolly Parton Imagination Library, which is providing books once a month to children birth to age 5. And then a number of grade level reading programs and other extracurricular, co-curricular programs, Kids on Course University. So there's a lot of great work. I hesitate to name them because I'm leaving out all kinds of things that are good, but these are research-based ways to move the needle forward for these families.
Okay. I'm encouraged by what I hear from you. As I understand the complexities of poverty, it encompasses all aspects of a person's life. And any solution, if I'm remembering my engineering friends, has to be as complex as the problem is. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad to hear these multifaceted approach. Chris, let me come back to you. You mentioned the mortgage interest deduction and retirement savings. How would you approach that? Both of those are both government mandated or government enabled, and private interests are involved in them. How would you approach those problems?
Well, the mortgage interest deduction is a great example of a program which is beloved by pretty much everyone, including renters. Oddly enough, they think it's some reason it has a high popularity. Yet even among homeowners, only about 10% of homeowners actually benefit from it. Since the new tax law, most people take the standard deduction, which was increased. So a very small percentage of people actually take advantage of the mortgage interest deduction. I'd eliminate it personally. It's something that Americans generally like, but economists hate. So I think it's something that has not proven to do what it was intended to do, which is increase home ownership. It's done the opposite, and it should be scrapped, is what I would like to see. For retirement, I think there's a lot of things that you could tinker with Social Security itself to make it less regressive against Hispanics and blacks. But I think even more a longer-term solution is to find ways to encourage people to hold equity within their families, as opposed to giving it to Uncle Sam, hoping they're going to get it back in retirement, but not being able to pass on any equity to future generations. And the Obama administration actually did start such a program. It was based upon a similar program that's available for federal workers. Unfortunately, they never really promoted it at all, so it never got going, and then it got eliminated with the current administration. So I think that would be something that'd be worthwhile looking at again. I think there's a lot of options there. Apart from other particular things, I'd just like to point out, and kind of echoing everybody's, I think this is a great example, and previous discussions here as well, that most of these problems we should be addressing are really complex, and it's great to have somebody like Stacey, and I've just met you, so I'll just put you in the middle since you're between us, but Stacey kind of on one side of the political spectrum, myself on another side of the political spectrum. We probably all have something useful to bring. None of us have all the answers. And so it's great to be able to bring together multiple viewpoints and have a collegial discussion about it, which is sorely lacking in today's political environment, right? So I think this is great that we do it, and special thanks to Stacey to stimulate this originally. I've loved getting into this.
We are running very short on time. Stacey, any last words?
Yeah, sure. If I could wave a magic wand and do a few things in this country and the community, I would make education free for everyone who was qualified and interested, and you would get any degree or be trained in any trade you'd like. And the government has a big role to play in making college and post-secondary training affordable and accessible to all people. We also need to have serious conversations about access to capital for individuals in this community. Who has access, why certain groups don't have access, and what they can do with that. And then finally, we need to have a serious conversation with people who run businesses or in positions of leadership and control about being intentional about the voices and perspectives that they elevate into leadership roles in our community.
Karla, I apologize greatly. We are out of time. I didn't manage our time very well.
So much to say, so little time.
On behalf of the Religious Council of Linn County, I'd like to thank all of you for a fascinating discussion, and to thank you, our viewers, for tuning in. Have a great week.